Good morning. I'm Johanna Derlega, publisher of The Hill. Welcome to this morning's discussion, Cracking the Tax Code, Prospects for Reform. I'd like to thank our sponsor, the Rate Coalition, for making it possible. This morning, we will be discussing current efforts to modernize the U.S. tax code. While there's general agreement among Republicans and Democrats that the American tax system is broken, they differ on how it can be fixed. Which proposals are currently taking center stage in Washington, and can any of them find bipartisan support? There's talk of lowering the tax rate. What might that mean for businesses, individual taxpayers, government revenue, and the economy at large? We will be tackling these questions with policymakers, business leaders, tax policy experts, as we discuss the prospects and potential impact of comprehensive tax reform. Before we get started, just a few notes of housekeeping. In addition to those of you here in the studio, we are live streaming on thehill.com. We ask that you keep your phones on silent, but we encourage you to join the conversation on social media. You can follow us on Twitter at The Hill Events, and you can comment using the hashtag #TaxRateTalk. We're going to be taking questions throughout the program, and so keep a lookout for members of the team with handheld mics. And finally, there is a short survey on your chairs. We would love your feedback at the end of the program. So let's dive right in. We begin this morning with Chairman Kevin Hassett. Chairman Hassett was sworn in as 29th Chairman of the President's Council of Economic Advisors last month. Prior to becoming chairman of the CEA, Chairman Hassett was an economist at the American Enterprise Institute, and he also worked as a senior economist at the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System. Joining the chairman is on stage is the Hill's editor-in-chief, Bob Cusack, and I'm turn it over to Bob. Welcome, Chairman.
Thank you.
I think there's a little more.
Yeah, we did great.
Okay. So Chairman Hassett, thanks for being here. Can you tell me a little bit about the day-to-day operations of the White House in dealing with tax reform, working with members of Congress, Gary Cohn, the Treasury Secretary? How does it all work?
Sure. I guess that since I've been sworn in for about a month, I can talk about what's been going on since I got there. It started with the Big Six negotiating an outline for a framework, but also thinking carefully about constructing a process that maximized the chances that tax reform would actually pass. Mm-hmm. And the CEA chair is not confirmed, wasn't part of the Big Six. I guess if I was there, it would have been the Awesome Seven or something like that. But honestly, I've been working in tax policy my whole life. I've been writing about it for about 30 years. And if you go through my work and sort of think about, well, what does that work imply we ought to be doing, it looks a lot like the outline that the President's team and the members of Congress came up with. And I want to talk about process for a minute, too, because what's going on right now is that people on the Hill they have a charge of the rates that the President and everybody have agreed to, and they want it to be revenue neutral, dynamically scored, mm-hmm. and they want it to pass. And so they sent instructions up to the Hill that were pretty flexible in terms of they can move the brackets where they need to in order to get the deficit exactly where they want. They're even willing to consider a higher top rate than 35% at some income above that if that's what it takes for senators to come together and vote for the thing. And so honestly, I think it's a really great example of President Trump's leadership that he's constructed not only a bill, an outline of a bill that meets his desires, but also a process that maximizes the chances that we actually get to a deal.
When are we going to see legislative text? We've been waiting a while.
Yeah, that's right. So I'm an economist, not a psychiatrist. So I don't speculate about Congress very much.
Smart.
It's a joke, guys. But honestly, it's a deliberative process that as people are thinking about their own objectives, each senator, then they might have questions. Well, what if we score it this way? What if we score it that way? I'm sure the people at the Joint Tax Committee that are very capable modelers are being punished for that right now with millions of requests for analysis. And mm-hmm. that process will hopefully come to a head sometime soon. But again, the objective of the process is to come up with a bill that, in an ideal world, I guess we're not in an ideal world, would get 100 votes in the Senate, because everybody gets to have a chance to participate in the process, to say, I think the bracket should go here, I think the top rate should be that. Mm-hmm. And folks in the Senate and the House are working that out right now.
Do you think that that we'll see something this month? The House is out next week, and then there are indications that we could see a bill right after that.
You'd have to ask them what their time frame is.
How optimistic are you, looking in your crystal ball, that this can get done this year?
You know, I think that I'm sort of somewhat well known for being an optimist, and so if you ask me if I'm optimistic, then I'm going to say, yeah, I'm optimistic, and then, you know, there's someone who knows me well. She's going to say, well, of course he's optimistic. He's optimistic that the rain's going to stop. But the fact is that in the end, the people I know on the Hill come here because they want to serve their country, because they care about making it a better place. And I think the case that this tax bill does that it improves GDP growth, it raises wages for America's workers, and so on, that case is just overwhelming. I think that if you sit down in a room and go through, you know, the modeling and the charts and the experience from other countries that we've assembled, then you just can't help but think, geez, I really need to do this. You know, over the last 8 years, the average real income growth was only about 0.6% per year. For the median, it was only about 0.6% per year. And that's just not fast enough. You know, if you have the sense that America's workers aren't keeping up, it's because they haven't been. And what President Trump wants the team to do is come up with a plan that fixes that. And we know that, you know, profit growth over the same time was almost 11% per year. And so it used to be that if profit growth went up 11%, then we'd expect wages to go up about 11%. But instead, you know, profit growth went up 11% and wages hardly budged. And you ask yourself, well, how could profit growth go up so much and not benefit workers? Well, the answer is the profits in Ireland. The wages in Ireland went up a lot, but the profits weren't here, and so the wages here didn't go up. And President Trump and his team have come up with a plan that'll fix that, and it really will. And President Trump's going to talk a lot about that today.
Right. He's giving a big speech on tax reform. So Democrats, from what they've seen, they've criticized that this is just a tax cut for the wealthy. Does this bill, is this going to help wealthy families? You know, Ben Carson said recently, the people who pay the most taxes should get a tax cut.
Right. Well, I think let's think back to what the process is. The process is that the Big Six have agreed to some rates and have agreed that also if another rate is necessary, then we'll have that too. The Big Six have said that we want this to be revenue neutral when dynamically scored, and that the share of taxes paid by the rich doesn't go down. Those are objectives right there in the agreement. And then, you know, with those things as a guide, if you think back to the '86 Tax Act, you know, then Democrats or Republicans came together and they said, what about here? Let's put it there. No, what about there? And they came to an agreement. And so I don't think that there's ever been a political process that was set up to have more bipartisan success than this. And now, it could be that you can't do that anymore, that everybody's so mad at each other that they won't actually do what's right for America's workers. But I know that we in the White House are hopeful that people will look at the analysis of this plan, at the sound design of both the plan and the process, and the massive benefit to workers that'll happen if the thing becomes law, and say, you know what, I really need to put politics aside and support that thing.
You mentioned the possibility of adding that fourth tax bracket. What do you think that will depend on as far as, yes, we do need it?
I think that ultimately, you know, whether they add that bracket or not is going to depend on the preferences of the people that are negotiating about the bill in the Senate. I think that, you know, if Democrats showed up and said, you know, we'll support this if you move it to here, then I would guess that people would listen.
Healthcare, replacing Obamacare did not succeed, and President Trump has indicated he wants to revisit the issue next year. But from a message standpoint, and that's some Republicans in retrospect said we didn't have a strong message on healthcare. What is going to be the 1, 2, 3 bumper sticker message on tax reform?
You know, I'm not exactly the message guy, and this was pointed out to me this morning as I was walking near the West Wing when someone suggested that I might be the first person this year to submit for review by the staff sec a memo that had equations in it. But we did. I imagine that, you know, the White House review process is, you know, they've decided that they need more calculus experts or something. And so I'm not really the message guy, maybe, but I could say that I know what the truth is. The truth is that a tax cut like this, you know, very conservatively, will increase the median wage by about $4,000 a year over a relatively short time. But if you look at some of the more optimistic estimates in the literature, and then run the thing over time, then you could be looking at $10,000, even $20,000 higher wages in the fullness of time relative to baseline. And that's the message of this tax reform. Wage growth has not nearly been good enough, and the reason is that the profits are in Ireland. And if we bring the profits back here, then wage growth could go back to being what it should be, which is going up and down the profits. And it hasn't been. So again, there was a structural break. I said this in a speech that I gave last week, that there's been a structural break in this relationship. So it used to be about one-for-one profit growth and wage growth. But sort of sometime in the 90s, that pattern of the data broke, and now it's the case that the correlation is only about 0.4. Mm-hmm. And so it's really, so there's still companies that are purely domestic companies, and if they have more profits, then they share the profits with workers. But most big multinationals now have decoupled that correlation completely.
When anyone's talking about tax reform, of course, the most controversial things are the revenue raisers. And one of the ideas that has been floated, certainly, and as some Republicans in California and New York have been concerned about eliminating the state and local tax deduction. Why was that chosen, and do you think that's going to stay in the proposal?
I think that there are very strong economic arguments for having a tax bill or a tax system that has a broad base and narrow rates that doesn't favor apples over oranges or anything else. That's where economic efficiency comes from. And the state and local income tax deduction is something that narrows the base and means that you have to have a higher rate on everything else because we have this narrower base. And it narrows the base in a way that I think is particularly unattractive, because imagine if you have one town or one state that isn't really taking care of business very well, that they're maybe spending lots of money on fancy public goods and have really, really high taxes. And then you have another place where there's maybe some more low-income town or state where they don't have big fancy public goods and they don't have high taxes. Well, the federal tax system is taking money from that poor state and giving it to the rich state right now. And it just doesn't make sense to me to have the federal government putting its finger on the scale. Frankly, the states should do whatever they want to do. In fact, there's this economist named Thibault who argued that that's a big constraint on runaway government, is that the states compete with each other, that they offer different bundles, and then people move to go to the state that has a government that runs the best. And so we absolutely celebrate the federal design, but I don't think that the federal government should favor one approach over the other.
As you know, President Trump at first advocated for a 15% corporate tax rate. Now that number's at 20, and the president has said he's not going any higher. But businesses have said it's very important for that tax rate to be permanent. Do you think that in this package, when it's released, will call for permanency?
Well, I think that it is very important that it be permanent, and I think that the president is right, to stick by a 20% rate. And I know that the budget process being what it is, that sometimes we pass bills that aren't permanent because it can't affect the budget outside of the 10-year window and things like that. And I think that everybody, my end of Pennsylvania Avenue, is hopeful that that stuff will get worked out and that we can have a nice permanent tax bill, because it will have stronger economic effects. To talk about the economics for a sec, because it's really simple. In the end, what happens when we model how taxes affect the economy is that we'll take a typical firm and tell them, here's what taxes look like, and then the firm will look at it and say, geez, I get to keep a lot more of my money, and so my target capacity, the scale that I want to have in the fullest of time, goes up by this much. And then it starts adjusting that way. It doesn't get there all the way overnight, because if you want to double the scale of your factory, then you got to buy some land, buy some buildings, put some machines in, train some workers. It takes a while. But if the tax goes down and then goes back up, then the firm is going to be reluctant necessarily to say add the new factory, because he thinks, oh, just when I finally get everything humming, then the tax rate goes back up, and then I don't want to have that new factory. And so you get a much smaller effect in the near term, even if 10 years out is when the rate goes back.
As far as paying for this bill, the Tax Policy Center put out an estimate, and safe to say you weren't a fan of that. Mm-hmm. What kind of growth are you going to assume that will pay for this? Because there's concern now with the debt level now surpassing $20 trillion. The last time tax cuts were passed in 2001, we were in a surplus. Now we are not.
I think that we have to wait and see what the final details are. Which was my main criticism of the Tax Policy Center, given the process that was set up, that was a process that was designed to gather bipartisan support, then the responsible thing to do would be to start playing the game the way that the designers of the game want it to be played, which is to say, hey, here's where you should put the brackets, and here's what the top rate should be. And if you do that, then that's a bill that we could support here at the Tax Policy Center. But instead, what they did is that they made assumptions about things that are still being negotiated on the Hill, and also seemed kind of designed to make the thing look as bad as possible and to give talking points maybe to political opponents of the bill. It's the exact opposite of what ought to happen. And in my talk at Tax Policy Center, I reminded them, and I remind the audience, that go back and look at the big major tax changes that we've had in U.S. history. It's always been a bipartisan effort. Kennedy got lots of Republicans, Reagan got lots of Democrats. Reagan was dealing with the Democratic Congress when they had the 86 Tax Act. And the reason is that in the end, just like a lot of my friends that are politicians, there are a lot of people up on the Hill, regardless of party, that want to do what's right for America's workers. We're living in a world where profits can go up 11%, but wages aren't budging because the profits aren't here. And we've got to do something about that. And if we don't do something about it, then you need to be satisfied with 0.6% per year wage growth. And the president's not satisfied with that. I get even emotional about the idea that we would make a choice like that.
We're going to open it up for questions. So if you have a question from the audience, if you can, we have people with mics. If you can identify yourself and pose your question. Not enough coffee yet, but there's one up here.
There's one over here.
Thank you. Is this on?
Yes, it is. I can hear you.
George Frampton, Partnership for Responsible Growth. We want to see tax reform paid for, so we think that means a carbon tax. Kevin, you talked pretty forthrightly the last couple of weeks about how this is all set up to be a bipartisan effort, but Senate leadership really seems determined to pursue tax reform exclusively through reconciliation, not talk to Democrats, at least until that fails or succeeds. Is the White House prepared to reach out over Republican leadership in the Senate and really try to start some discussions with Democrats at some point?
I'm not a political expert. It's good to see you. It's been a while since I remember you coming to my office and talking about a whole bunch of stuff. But, I'm not a political expert. I think that a lot of times what's going on in town is that people are resigned to doing things with one party. But we should always enter a process like this hopeful that, a better mood can prevail. I was kind of in limbo for a long time just myself in the confirmation process, which is, a sign of how out of control Washington is, because how could I? I'm just teasing. But it's actually true that historically the CEA chair is someone that just gets confirmed right away, like often out of committee to the floor, in a week. And the gap between out of committee and the floor vote for me was the longest that we've ever seen for a CEA chair. But then when I did get a vote, I got the majority of the Democrats to vote and all the Republicans. And so it's not like necessarily I was that controversial. It's just that everybody's so mad about everything that even a CEA chair, who really doesn't have any authority over anything, right, is something that can take months and months and months and months to do. And I think that is what's wrong with Washington. That's why people think of us as a swamp. And hopefully, when we're presented with overwhelming evidence of how much good something can do, that we can come together, on a bipartisan basis and do something. And I'm sure that if, half the Democrats went to Senator McConnell and said, hey, do this little thing and we'll support it, that he'd be, overjoyed.
Any other questions from the audience? As far as, when you look back to 2001, 28 House Democrats did vote for that tax cut. Mm-hmm. In the Senate, 12 Democrats voted for that. But are you guys talking to Democrats? I know President Trump hosted Democrats, including Ranking Member Richard Neal, who we'll hear from next. Do you think that, obviously, as you've kind of indicated, I don't think any type of 1986-like cooperation is going to be happening, but that you could, because this is going to be so appealing to at least some Democrats in red states that you're going to pick off a few.
So again, I'm not in any way related to the political process. I'm not a political strategist, and people, wouldn't take my advice if I offered it, I'm sure, and that would be a good call. But the fact is that the economic substance of what the president's trying to do is so powerfully positive for this country that, I have a hard time understanding why someone wouldn't support at least the process that we've undertaken to begin. And, the reason is that wage growth in America has been terrible. It's one reason why I think that people around the country are desperate for change and are tired of a swamp that doesn't serve them. And we've got a plan that will serve them, that will give them higher wages. And I think that if we were successful at that, that one would hope that there wouldn't be like half the people in Washington are really annoyed because one party had a success, but rather everybody should be happy because they helped Americans have a better life and they did it together. And I think that's a much better future world for us to live in. But make no mistake that absolutely 100%, we're convinced unanimously on the Trump team, and I think many people on the Hill, that this tax cut and this tax reform is a really, really big part of making America great again, of turning this country around. And it really needs to pass, and it needs to pass not so that some party can beat some other party in the next election. It needs to pass because it's going to radically lift wages for workers who haven't seen much of a raise over the last decade.
Last question.
Thanks very much for holding this forum. And I'm speaking a little against interest because I'm a partisan Democrat. I don't particularly think that we need or really want a very big tax cut right now. But let's say for the sake of argument that we do, we need it to be large enough to create this growth phenomenon that you're counting on. But there are three very big obstacles. There's the fiscal obstacle. Currently, all projections, all models show trillion-dollar deficits 10 years out. We got an equity problem with a lot of focus on, repealing the estate tax, the top rate. And then finally, all the discussions about the deductions, whether it's the BAT or the SALT, feature winners against losers, and the thing just grinds to a halt. So how's this for a solution? For all three things, cap deductions.
Cap all deductions.
Well, or enough of them to get where you want to get. We're not hearing about that.
I think that you're actually doing really the respectable thing exactly in this process, which you're saying. I think that if we cap deductions, then maybe we could achieve the objectives. And that's exactly the kind of discussion that everybody thinks should be going on right now in the Senate. I mentioned at my remarks at the Tax Policy Center last week that Arthur Okun, a Brookings scholar who was also chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors, used the analogy of a leaky bucket. He said that for efficiency, we need to take some water from the people who have it to the people who don't, but we recognize that as we carry the water, that the bucket leaks, and that there's a trade-off between equity and efficiency. And what I said in those remarks and what I firmly believe is that we all might have slightly different preferences about how much equity we need, how much we're willing to trade off equity versus efficiency. But those who say, hey, we should look only at efficiency, and those who say, hey, we should only look at statically scored equity, that they're not actually playing a game that Art Okun would have told us we should play. And that was the game that the Tax Policy Center was playing. They were saying the bucket don't leak. And there are other people who say, hey, we should look only at growth. And I agree with you that what we need to do is we need to think about a leaky bucket, how much, what the trade-offs are. And so now let's accept that. So if we accept that that's the way we're going to do it, then what would you do? And I would put forward that you would begin a process just like the one that's just begun. That you said we need to have an individual income tax reform. We target simplification. We'd like to see these rates, but you guys decide where the brackets go and whether we need a higher top rate as you're balancing equity and efficiency and thinking about what the optimal trade-off is in the Senate. Aggregating the preferences of each senator is pretty tough. But the Senate has delivered in the past, and there's a chance they can deliver again. And if they do deliver now or at any point in the future, my suggestion is that it's going to be because a process just like this one worked. And I think that this one can.
Well, we've run out of time. Please thank Chairman Hassett, and I'll hand it over back to
Thank you very
Chairman.
much.